Well, I just want to start by saying thank you to everyone for being here. Thank you, Eric. Thank you, Evan. You've all been very patient. This is, yeah, so my work here kind of builds from my thesis. And just to kind of start off, I want to briefly go over what my thesis was about. A brief background. So basically, I'm looking at Indian contemporary art in the 2000s. And the reason why I'm interested is because India went through this period of economic liberalization in the 90s, which really opened up its economy to the sort of global trade. You suddenly had a very high rise in income levels, and also a sudden interest in art as a not just an asset class but also as a as a symbolic thing, right? So the India's premier artists, I'm thinking of people like M.F. Hussain or Raza, who are really the face of modern Indian art. They were culturally very significant, but you could buy their works for like $150, and they never relied on just gallery sales for sustenance. But increasingly in the 2000s, you had this system of auctions and exhibitions and art houses emerge, in which these works were suddenly gaining exorbitant prices along with new contemporary work. And so my thesis really looks at how that world was changing in that decade for Indian contemporary artists with these new institutions popping up. And it focuses on four, what I call domains of visibility. That is four places where you can see art or sort of interact with it. The first is survey exhibitions. So there was a series of survey exhibitions in the 2000s, which is basically international curators kind of working together to stage these exhibitions of Indian contemporary art, where they like group all these artists together and show them around as being like, look, this is the face of what's happening in South Asia right now, creatively speaking. Then you have like biennales, which are literally, it means like once every 2 years, but they're also kind of art exhibitions, but they're more sort of geared towards presenting newer avant-garde forms of work, which are often not for sale in the event itself. Then you also have museums where you can go where you can go see art, and then you have, of course, auctions. I also want to mention that there are galleries and fairs, but I haven't included them in my thesis because it's notoriously hard to get galleries to reveal information. Um, the two case studies that I've been looking at, particularly in my thesis at least, are these two artists called Shilpa Gupta and Jitish Kalat. Shilpa is this image on the left with the gate, and this is a piece that she put up in the Venice Biennale, which is the most important biennale as of now in the world. And it's just this gate that swings back and forth and sort of breaks the wall that it's attached to. Very conceptual. Gupta is known for being a kind of biennale artist. She's known for producing work that is sort of difficult to categorize and difficult to exchange, right? So she doesn't fit in those commodity structures very well, as opposed to Jitish Kalat, who on the here right is another artist who has his work that his work has been commodified to a considerable degree. As I will show later, he's one of the most sort of preferred artists in auction circuits. And so really what I wanted to do was I wanted to see in my thesis, how these two artists have navigated this new landscape. And in order to do that, I had to categorize the landscape, which goes like this, right? So you have these survey exhibitions, and if an artist goes to is shown at a lot of survey exhibitions, it's very likely that they'll also be shown at biennales, at museums, and that the museums will collect their work internationally. So I'm thinking of MoMA, the Met, every other big name that you can think of. And then also, if they show at these exhibitions, it's also likely that their work is going to be put up at auctions. Biennales, being a little bit more of an avant-garde space, they do affect an artist's museum collectability, but they might not have that much of an effect on auctions. And if anything, it suggests that like being a biennale artist, quote unquote, is actually harmful for your commercial performance in these circuits. The way I came about this was through a series of regressions, which I don't think I really want to discuss right now because I'd rather focus on what I did for the digital humanities work, which is I basically, because my thesis was much more about the case studies that I described earlier, through the fellowship, I really wanted to explore the quantitative aspect of it more. So to that end, like the fellowship really helped me gather data from, like basically sort of pay my friends to kind of go through it and get hours and hours of data, which I wouldn't have been able to do on my own. I also was able to use the help of Amherst professors and UMass students who were sort of much more statistically inclined than I was. And what I did using the fellowship was that I looked at this network of institutions over time. So what I did in my thesis was I had like this 10-year block as this one single thing, but I wanted to also look at how it changed over those 10, 15 years. And so I'm going to discuss those two institutions, exhibitions and biennales, in our presentation today, just for considering the time. But there's also sort of analyses for auctions and museums. So just starting with the exhibition circuits. I don't know if it's, hold on. Is it going to the next page?
It's sticking, oh, now it's,
Nope,
you're
sorry.
back in, okay.
Okay, great. So just before so you can see the different graphs, right? The networks.
Yes.
Great, so just before I launch into it, I just want to briefly go over these different measures of centrality in a network. The two that I want to draw your attention to are the K-core and eigenvector centrality measures. I won't describe them quantitatively, but just to give you an idea of what it is, each node, which is each point, so these are nodes and then the lines are edges. Each node, in the eigenvector centrality measure, each node is given a weighting depending on not just how many other nodes they're connected to, but how many nodes those nodes are connected to, right? So this one has a sort of pretty high rating because it's connected to other big nodes. Whereas this one is also connected to a lot of nodes, but it doesn't have that high of a rating. The K-core measure is a little different in that it discretizes it. So it creates a bunch of nodes that it considers to be at the core of the network, and then a bunch of other nodes that it considers to be at the periphery. This is a network graph of the biennale circuits that I made. And it uses the same measures, except it's not the size that uses the centrality measure, it's the color. So these green points that you see are nodes that are important, so to speak, and the purple ones are less so. Each node is an artist, and each line basically dictates whether or not those artists have worked at the same biennale together. So, for example, Shilpa Gupta has exhibited her works with Bania Bibi very often in a lot of different biennales, which is why her edge is so thick. And then you have someone like Gauri Gill, who hasn't worked, or Nikhil Chopra, sorry, who hasn't worked with Shilpa Gupta that often, but has at least once. What this network does tell you is that, Shilpa Gupta is at the center of those biennale circuits. So of all the sort of biennale exhibitions that happened over the past 10 years that had South Asian artists, it was very likely that Shilpa Gupta would be in them. Jitish Kallat, who's my second case study, is also here, but in a much more reduced capacity. Another interesting thing about these networks is this biennale network particularly is that there seem to be these satellite groups, which means that you have these artists who are exhibiting together, but not with anyone else, which is an interesting kind of behavior. Drawing from there, what I wanted to see was, well, this is a very simple bar graph. It just explains, so you have green, which is Shilpa Gupta, purple, which is Jitish Kallat, and blue, which is like all the other Indian artists who are at these biennales. You can see that Shilpa Gupta's presence at biennales kind of really grew after 2005 and then started to recede around 2009. Kallat is hardly present. He's there in 2006, but it really is significant that in 2007, around 40% of all biennales had Shilpa Gupta in them, which is, it's considerable thinking about like just how many biennales there are in a year. And so this is another kind of measure that I wanted to look at when I was looking at biennales. And this really looks at how their influence changed over time, right? So there's two axes. I'm just kind of carefully going to go through these. There's two axes. The bottom one, which I'm calling del E, is the change in eigenvector centrality from 2010 to 2000. So if this bar is positive, it means that this artist kind of went towards the center of the network. Whereas if the bar is negative, it means that the artist moved toward the periphery. But also keep in mind that this is just a change, right? So you could have an artist like Sudarshan, let's see, like Enes Harsha, who was very prominent in biennale circles, but became slightly less so. But that doesn't really give you an absolute sense of how many biennales they performed in over time, which is this red line. So these dots tell you just how many biennales they were in the last 10 years, right? So you have someone like Amar Kanwar here, whose position in the network didn't really change over the 10 years that I'm recording, but who nonetheless exhibited in a high number of works. Looking at our artists, Gupta is right on top, both in terms of her increased influence and the number of biennales that she was exhibiting in. right? So this red dot tells you that she was there in like sort of most of the biennales that were happening, but also that the biennales that she was in, she was also exhibiting with other very important artists, which boosted her eigenvector centrality score. Then you have Jitish Kallad, who unfortunately, again, was in a lot of biennales, just as much as Bani Abidi, who's the second most influential at this point. But his influence decreased because perhaps he wasn't exhibiting in quote unquote important biennales. Um, so that's, that gives you a kind of characterization of how these two artists operated, in that Kallad seems to have not focused that much on biennale circuits as much as Gupta did. And Gupta, so to speak, picked the right circuits to go to. Then you have the exhibition circuits, which in my thesis, I argue are like slightly different in that they're much more commodity friendly. Again, you have Gupta and Kallad who are at the center, but you can also see from this graph that it's a much more cacophonous one. You have less satellite behavior in exhibition circuits, right? So you have some satellites near the top right, but otherwise everyone's mostly connected to each other. And that's because when these artists were exhibited, it was normally the same stock of artists being shown again and again, right? Because, partly the whole purpose of these survey exhibitions was to create a new sort of class or an era of artists for the world to recognize. But this cluster that you see on top here is all Pakistani artists. So Aisha Khalid, Nusrat Latif Qureshi. What this tells you is that when there were Pakistan-centered exhibitions, you would have all of these people showing together, but they weren't necessarily included in the South Asian/Indian exhibitions unless they exhibited with Rashid Rana, who is part of the center. Kind of just going through the same motion here. This is each of their performances in exhibition circuits. So as you can see, Shilpa Gupta started out being sort of a significant component of exhibitions in her early years. But as time went on, she became sort of a very small, she started showing in fewer and fewer exhibitions. Whereas Kallad kind of maintained his little niche, or maybe I should say considerable niche, because he's been sort of a constant presence at these exhibitions over time. And again, going through the same kind of graph, what you see here is that Kallad, although he has the highest number of exhibition appearances in that decade, he only managed to sort of increase his influence just that much, which is, it is not non-significant, but it's also, given the number of exhibitions he was in, you would expect that he would have a higher influence. Whereas someone like Hema Upadhyay participated in fewer exhibitions, but she has more sort of garnered more influence, so to speak. And then you have Shilpa Gupta, who was again in a lot of exhibitions, but clearly her position in the network sort of moved towards the periphery for reasons that I sort of could explore later. How are we doing on time? I just wanted to check.
You're all set.
Okay, great. So this is what I just wanted to give you a kind of short sort of introduction to what I was doing. In conclusion, the sort of fairly obvious points are that Shilpa moved toward the biennale circuits over time, and Gupta moved away from the biennale circuits and into exhibition circuits, although both of them started off at the center of both these circuits, right? And then also, other questions that I wanted to go into, but I didn't have time, unfortunately, is, this model kind of almost assumes that curators don't really exist, right? That these artists completely are in control of what exhibitions they get to go to. But really, it's the relationship with curators that determines, where they get to show works and, where they get to be popular. So I would also want to include curator information, although I have it, I just haven't been able to incorporate it. I would also want to build my data set for museums more, because it's difficult to kind of go through the museum's entire collection and figure out which artists they have. I have been using some kind of scraping tools from Python and R, but I would want to develop them further. And then I also want to incorporate other agents who are sort of important to this landscape, namely curators and gallerists and so on, who have a lot of influence in what goes on in these places.
Yael Rice says, your project combines computational analysis using DH methods and interviews with artists, collectors, gallerists, etc. How do you think your interviewees would respond to the DH findings? Did your findings map onto any information these individuals shared with you?
That's a great question. Yeah, so I don't know. I don't really know how my interviewees would sort of respond. Well, artists particularly, I don't think they would be too happy to see this kind of work, because like it's difficult to quantify an artist's work and to say something about them based on just the network. So it ignores the works themselves. But as for like the kind of findings based on other people's opinions, I have sort of gone through a lot of archives to find that, there are people who've commented on how these artists have moved towards their own sort of specific niches. There's this curator who used to be the director of the Asia Society in New York. Her name is Vishaka Andesai, and a lot of what she's noticed about the Indian art world in the 2000s internationally really resonates with what I've been talking about. So I think you'll find people like on both ends of the spectrum. It's very sensitive work because, again, like, it's difficult to sort of put numbers on these people. But I think it does, sort of point out larger patterns that these artists sometimes aren't willing to see.
What inspired you to approach your research question using computational methods? Is it common in the field of art history?
Yeah, that's a great question as well. I think it really arose from, when I was thinking about these artists earlier on. There's this sociologist called Pierre Bourdieu who was very important a few decades ago in thinking about taste, and particularly the way that taste is influenced by class. And so a lot of his work in sociology involved kind of looking at macro patterns, and a lot of his work involved some form of computational / statistical analysis. I think that's where I really sort of draw my roots from, I guess. But to answer your question, it's not super common in art history, but I think increasingly a lot of very interesting work is being done. There's also this very interesting form of digital humanities work called discourse analysis that uses like that tries to sort of evaluate text and sentiment, and everything that goes into sort of the discussion of certain artists using quantitative methods. So I think there's a lot that's promising, and I'm pretty excited to be in this space right now.